On the 23rd of January 1999, in the High Court, the legal representations of Jack Womes and Michael Steele applied for leave to appeal their convictions imposed on their clients at the Old Bailey on the 20th of January 98. In seeking leave to appeal, they contested all the convictions against them, including the conspiracy to invade the prohibition of the importation of cannabis, but their greatest concern centred on gaining leave to appeal the convictions for the murders in Essex of 3 men on the 6th of December 1995. Michael Steele and Jack Womes were jointly found guilty of the murder and sentenced to 15 years imprisonment each. The killings became known as the Retterdon murders. The victims were Anthony Tucker, Craig Rolfe and Patrick Tate, 3 ruthless and powerful gangland figures who controlled a drugs and protection empire in Essex. They had forged a reputation which moved police to describe them as underworld figures compared with the Krays and their criminal dynasty of the 60s. The 3 had been taken to describe themselves as the Firm, a sobriquet favoured by the notorious East End hoodlums when they were at their pinnacle of their infamy. The case against Womes and Steele relied entirely on the evidence of a known police informant, Darren Nichols, who at the time of cooperating with the police was in custody and facing a very severe sentence for a major drugs offence. There was no forensic, scientific or direct evidence against them other than a very frail and confused case, built around a series of mobile phone calls which the defence claimed pointed to the client's innocence rather than the imputation placed on it by the judge and subsequently the jury. There was no identified motive for Womes and Steele to murder the victims. Indeed, a pointer to the tenuous nature of the case against the accused was underlined when an undercover police officer tried to manufacture a motive for posing as an IRA gangster trying to entrap Steele into saying that he owed a large sum of money to the victims and the IRA had bought the debt. Evidence of the laughable ploy was captured on a tape in the possession of the defence counsel of the convicted men. The officer was later prosecuted for corruption and was the same officer who had been responsible for running Darren Nichols as an informant when he gave evidence against Womes and Steele. Interwoven into the murky world of drugs and violence inhabited by the 3 victims was a history which produced a plethora of people who had clear motives for the gangland assassination. Those who had been knifed, shot or tortured by them or their henchmen were manifold. One victim actually shot Pat Tate. Steve Ellis was so persecuted by the 3 that in a moment of blind panic he shot one of his tormentors. A contract was put out on Ellis by them and the plan was to lure Ellis to Tate's bedside at the hospital to discuss their grievances. When it was planned Tate would shoot him, arguing that Ellis had come to finish Tate off. Somebody who worked with Tate and Tucker had tipped Ellis off and the shooting never took place. Tucker knew who had told Ellis and they suspected the police, but it was another score that would settle when the moment was right, especially when Tate was found in possession of the gun and returned to prison. That man, a friend of Ellis and a prominent figure in the drugs and violent empire controlled by the 3 murdered men. The crack marksman who had been in the army and served in Northern Ireland and had worked in South Africa in a so-called mercenary police force, who had been jailed for attempted murder and illegalised possession of firearms, ran a security operation at Raquel's at the time of Leah Bett's ecstasy death scandal and was high on the police list of suspects as a supplier of the fatal tablet. He was one of the prime suspects in the Retterdon murders at one time, but his profile waned in the investigation when he cooperated with the police in providing evidence against a suspect in the Leah Bett's case. The macabre death of known drug dealer Kevin Whitaker was widely ascribed to Tucker and Rolfe. Tate was in hospital at the time of his death, having been shot by Ellis. Tucker and Rolfe were questioned by the police along with Rolfe's girlfriend Donna Jaggers. Whitaker had supplied the firm with a large quantity of drugs and they decided they were big enough not to pay him for them. When Whitaker made noises about the non-payment, he was invited to a flat to talk about what looked like something which could escalate into a gang war. It was there that Whittaker was attacked and injected in the testicles with a large shot of heroin, from which he died. When Tate was in hospital, he was visited by Darren Nichols, the police informant, in the Worms and Steele murder trial, where Tucker tells Tate, "We won't be getting any more trouble from Mr. Whittaker." These were the exact words used by Nichols when he described at the trial what Steele had said about the Rettendon shootings. Doubtless Whittaker had acquired the drugs from someone else who would be extremely unhappy that the paymaster had been wiped out. Rumour was rife that it was a very high-profile London crime syndicate, and the matter was not to end there. Such was the level of savagery they were capable of stooping to that a friend of Tate's girlfriend's, who went to pick her up from their home at the time of a domestic split, was tortured by the trio, stripped naked and burned all over his body with lighted cigarettes until he was a complete physical and mental wreck, in the need of psychiatric counselling. It was acts of barbarity like this which has established their reputation for a level of ruthlessness which, they believed, had made them virtually untouchable. Such were the feelings of instability that they cockily snubbed an invitation from London gangsters still linked to the Cray Empire to combine their operation, retorting that they were burnt-out has-beens who belonged to a bygone age. Perhaps this was the moment they put the final signatures to their own death warrants. What the three thugs didn't realise was that the constant practice of robbing other criminal gangs of large consignments was building to an inevitable moment of retribution which could only have one possible outcome. It was just a matter of who got to them first. Certainly, in a lot of people's minds, after the Rettendon murders, was the possibility that Leah Betts' father, an ex-policeman, and himself a crack shot with a gun, had been involved in their demise. It was a mouth-watering vigilante scenario which many prayed would become a reality. It was clear, with the passing of time, that it was to remain a romantic notion. There were too many hideous and menacing candidates forming in a very long queue. The Betts theory gained a lot of credibility because the three thugs had been blasted to death a month after Leah's tragic death, and just 4 days before her funeral. In the Mirror, 2 days after the three were murdered, a CID source was quoted as saying it was a brilliantly executed assassination. The victims were lured to the lane to discuss having someone else hit, but the tables were turned on them. We had excellent information that Rolfe and Tate had been trying to hire a killer to rub out a rival drug dealer, but it seems the intended victim got his shot in first. In the Daily Express, of the same date, similar information had been received. The gangster allegedly ordered their assassination after he was tipped off they were planning to kill him for being a police informant. The man, who has links to the Crays and other gangland family, was accused of revealing the trio's drug-dealing activities. There had been a confrontation just a week before the murders when Tucker had obtained a machine gun from a Mickey Bowman who had been arrested for supplying the gun. Police learned the weapon was wanted by Tate and Tucker, who needed to kill someone with it. Conveniently, Jack Worms was asked by Nichols to pick up his car from a pub car park in Rettendon. It was an ideal way of establishing telephone links between them. It was hard to believe that a man who had just assassinated three dangerous thugs who was about to do so would concern himself with the role of becoming an automobile rescue service. No time of death was ever established at the inquest or the trial. It was another inexplicable case of bungling inefficiency between the police surgeon, and the pathologist. Nobody had asked anybody else to take responsibility for its establishment. The general view was that the killings took place between 6 and 7 in the evening. For Nichols' evidence to be believed, it had to be at that time. This fact was challenged because the windows of the Range Rover the men were shot in were not frozen up. It had been a cold and frosty evening with early snow and the rest of the night not being so cold. Indeed, by the morning, the ice puddles had thawed. The farmers who found the body stated that their vehicle's windows were frozen up when they went to start it up in the morning. They had parked their vehicle more or less the same time as Nichols claimed the Range Rover would have arrived at the scene of the crime. At this time, Michael Steele had an alibi provided by a mother and her daughter who stated they were at his home with him and his partner until 9:30 that evening. Jack Womes, who claimed to have been invited to the area that evening to collect a car which Nichols wanted disposing of, said he would have been on his way home. He collected the car from the Wheatsheaf Public House car park where it had broken down and had hoisted and secured it onto a trailer. It was a Volkswagen Passat and the same vehicle as Nichols said he drove Womes to the murder site in. Nichols states that when he collected Womes in the car, he pulled off surgical gloves, which were speckled with blood. Womes claimed Nichols had asked him to get rid of the car so he could claim insurance on it. Instead, Womes gave the car to a friend who was involved in stock car racing. Womes told the police where they could find the car and it was forensically tested. Hardly the actions of someone who knew, if Nichols was to be believed, that his blood samples would be in the car, which in fact they were not. Nobody heard the volley of shots at that time described by Nichols, and quite clearly they would have been audible at least a mile around the scene of the crime. Simon Rogers, a man who lived in a detached property nearby which had stables, stated that he heard what he described as a fusillade of shots at around midnight on the night of the killings. He had come out of his house to feed a young horse when he heard the shots, describing them as being in quick succession and within a duration of 6 to 10 seconds. He had no doubts about what he had heard and no doubts about the direction from which they had come. He had reported the shots to the police when he'd heard gunfire 3 days later during the daytime. It was common for people to go shooting there in the daytime as a sporting activity, but never after darkness and certainly not at midnight. He knew both sets of shots had come from the same place, which was the farm where the men had been killed on the 6th of December. Strangely, as a result of a witness summons stemming from another police matter not linked with the Rettendon killings, another witness came forward. He was William Jasper, who was being held by London police on another charge. He had stated when questioned by the police that he had been made a journey on or about the times of the killings to Rettendon. He did not then know it was Rettendon until he accompanied police twice on journeys to the area he had visited around the times of the shootings. He led the police back to Rettendon. They did not direct his route. He did not know Steele or Womes and stated he had never met them in his life. He did not know he would be required to give evidence at their trial until the day before he appeared before the court. Jasper had been arrested on the 15th of January 1996 on the other matter and stated he was associate of major London criminals who were involved in very large drug deals and major robberies. He stated he knew he was in the area of Rettendon when he made the drive back, and he said he missed the Rettendon turnpike on the journey and had to turn around. He described how he had looked into holdall carried by the passenger on that journey and he'd seen a pump-action shotgun. He described the journey back and where he had dropped the man off. He said he'd been paid £5,000 for the job. Most importantly, he described at the time he had dropped his passenger off in Rettendon at about midnight, exactly the time that Simon Rogers, the man feeding his horse, had heard the fusillade of shots coming from the place where the trio were gunned down. Jasper had known nothing of this evidence when he had told police of his involvement, and he knew nothing at all when he gave his evidence. Clearly, the trio's grim landscape of drugs, violence and robbery was peppered with people who had very good reason to dispose of Tate, Tucker and Rolfe. They were loathed and despised by so many. Outside of Essex, they had overstepped their perceived power and offended and robbed gangs who would regard their emergence of the godfathers they thought they were as little more than the immature flexing of muscles by a trio of mere upstarts. They would be tolerated up to a point. Their activities towards the end of their lives clearly overstepped those boundaries. Within their own territory, they created enemies who were quite capable of exacting retribution, men perhaps more ruthless than themselves, and certainly a lot cleverer. It will never, in all probability, be known who cold-bloodedly possessed the blinding hatred that would allow a human being to blow the brains out of three relatively young men with the squeezing of a trigger. What is for certain is that the killer would need a very strong motive, be it greed, power or revenge. The two men serving prison sentences for this crime have none of these things. The removal of Tate, Tucker and Rolfe from the planet never changed their lives one iota, except for the worse. Indeed, Wholmes had never met Tucker and Rolfe and had never fallen out with Tate, and there was no evidence that Steele's relationship with the trio had become soured. They now languish in prison for a crime they had no reason to commit.